It was an uncharacteristically cold morning in Manhattan. The usually bustling streets felt somewhat muted, as though the chill had dampened the city's restless energy. But in the midst of this quiet, something unexpected was happening. Thomas Reed, an affluent businessman known for his exacting standards and no-nonsense demeanor, was on his way to his favorite coffee shop. As he passed through the crowds, his mind was already occupied with the busy day ahead: a meeting with shareholders, a quick lunch with a client, and a presentation in the afternoon. But all of that was about to shift in the blink of an eye. In one fleeting moment, Thomas felt a slight tug near his wrist. He glanced down, and his heart sank. A prized possession, his luxury watch, was gone. Panic surged through him. This wasn't just any watch. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of hard-earned success, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing it. A quick scan of his surroundings showed a small figure slipping deftly through the crowd. Thomas's gaze sharpened as he recognized the telltale sign of a thief in action. Without a second thought, he broke into a run, weaving through pedestrians, determined not to let this mystery pickpocket get away. He watched as the figure, a young boy no older than 12, turned sharply, disappearing down a narrow alleyway. Thomas hesitated. His schedule flashed through his mind again, reminding him of the dozens of people awaiting his arrival and the important tasks on his agenda. But a stronger instinct overtook him: the need to recover his watch and, oddly, an unexpected curiosity about the boy who dared to take it. He followed the boy down the alley, navigating through the maze of backstreets with surprising determination. As he turned another corner, he caught sight of the boy again. This time, the boy paused, clutching the watch in his hand, and looked around, seemingly lost in thought. "Hey!" Thomas called out, his voice carrying a mix of anger and disbelief. The boy's head jerked up, and for a moment, they locked eyes. But just as quickly, the boy turned and bolted down another passageway. Thomas quickened his pace, finally catching up as the boy stumbled to a halt in front of an old building at the edge of a forgotten park. To his surprise, the boy didn't flee into the building but rather slowed his steps and walked up to a figure, a woman standing just outside the entrance. The boy handed her the watch, his voice soft but carrying in the stillness. "Here, Mom." Thomas froze, watching as the woman took the watch with a gentle smile and placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. Something about her seemed strangely familiar, stirring a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Thomas stood rooted in place, heart pounding from the chase and from a rising feeling he couldn't yet name. He watched from a distance as the boy handed over the watch, and the woman's gentle hand rested on the boy's shoulder. The light in the park was soft, filtered through thin branches that trembled slightly in the morning breeze. She turned to face the boy, her face coming into view. Thomas felt the world slow, his eyes fixed on her, and everything else fell away. The park, the cold, the sound of traffic fading into the background. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, though he couldn't yet place where or when he'd seen her before. He could see her clearly now. Her hair, slightly disheveled, fell around her face with a softness that belied a life that hadn't been easy. Her clothing was simple, worn, the kind people wore out of necessity rather than style. "Mom," the boy said, his voice more audible now in the stillness of the park. I got this for you." The woman glanced down at the watch with a mixture of surprise and sorrow. She didn't scold or ask questions, simply took the watch from his outstretched hand and brought him closer in an embrace. "Jake," she murmured, her voice low and affectionate, though tinged with exhaustion. "Where did you get this? You know you can't just take things. We'll figure things out together, okay?" The boy, Jake, looked down, a faint trace of guilt crossing his face, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a fierce loyalty, a look of determination to protect her, to do whatever he needed to keep them both afloat. It struck Thomas with a force he didn't expect, the boy's loyalty, his fierce, defiant love. A sharp pang twisted in his chest, but his attention shifted back to the woman, who was now holding the watch in her hand, turning it over as if trying to make sense of it. And that's when it hit him. Memories rushed forward, flooding his mind with fragments of a life he'd thought he'd buried long ago. A smile shared across a candlelit table, quiet laughter, the the sound of a song drifting through a long-ago summer night. He felt his heart lurch as the pieces fell into place. The woman standing before him wasn't a stranger. She was Sarah, his Sarah. A dozen questions exploded in his mind. Sarah, his fiancée, the woman he had once planned to spend his life with, had disappeared years ago without a trace. He had searched and then, when no answers came, had been forced to let her go, leaving only memories and a hollow space that he had never been able to fill. Yet here she was, alive, in front of him, and she had a son. Thomas took a step closer, struggling to keep his breathing steady, desperate to get her attention but unwilling to startle her. She hadn't seen him yet, completely absorbed in her son. In the gentle way she stroked his hair as she spoke quietly to him. He swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. "Sarah?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. She looked up, her eyes searching the park before they finally landed on him. Her face registered a flicker of recognition, but there was no warmth, no shock, no joy in her eyes. Instead, she wore an expression of polite curiosity, as if she were seeing a familiar stranger, someone she might have once known, but had no attachment to. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he stepped forward, torn between hope and confusion. "Sarah?" "It's me, Thomas," he said softly, almost pleading. She blinked, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she took him in. There was a moment's hesitation before she answered, her voice as soft as he remembered, but now wrapped in layers of something unreadable. "Do I know you?" she asked, a puzzled frown tugging at her brow. Thomas felt his breath catch, his mind refusing to process what he just heard. He searched her face for any sign, any indication that she remembered, that she knew him. But there was nothing there. Only a gentle, patient confusion, as if he were just some passerby, someone who'd mistaken her for another. "Yes, it's me. Thomas Reed." He paused, feeling a wave of emotions he could barely contain. We were together, years ago. You." But before he could finish, the boy, Jake, stepped protectively in front of her, his eyes narrowing at Thomas, every inch of him radiating a fierce determination to protect her from this stranger. "Hey, leave her alone," Jake said, voice firm. Thomas raised his hands, trying to reassure the boy, though he couldn't pull his gaze from Sarah's face. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said carefully, his voice barely more than a whisper. I know her." Sarah's face softened slightly as she placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, her eyes returning to Thomas with a touch of sympathy. But it wasn't the sympathy of someone who recognized him. It was the sympathy of a stranger. "Look, I don't know who you are," she said gently, "but I think you're confusing me with someone else." A deep chill settled over Thomas. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. But there was no mistaking her. This was Sarah, the love of his life, standing just a few feet away. Yet she looked at him as if he were a ghost, someone who didn't belong in her world. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Sarah, please, it's really me, Thomas. You just don't remember. Something must have happened to you. I need to understand." She stepped back, her expression cautious, and shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, but I think you're mistaken. My name is not Sarah. It's Marie." Thomas's mind reeled, spinning with the weight of her words. She had a different name, a new life, and apparently no memory of him. A wave of helplessness washed over him, his fingers clenching and unclenching as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Marie," he repeated, the name foreign on his lips, the sound of it stinging his heart. He wanted to reach out, to grab her hand, to make her remember. But he could feel the wall between them, the gulf of lost years, of memories she seemed to have forgotten. He looked down at Jake, who was still watching him warily, protectively. Realizing he was out of options, Thomas took a step back, nodding, though his heart screamed at him not to leave. "I'm sorry, Marie. I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his voice barely steady. "I just thought you were someone I used to know." With that, he turned and walked away, his chest tight, his mind flooded with questions. But one thing was certain, he would be back. Whatever had happened to Sarah, to Marie, he was determined to find out. And if she had forgotten him, he would make sure she remembered. The day had passed in a fog for Thomas. The thrill of his boardroom success, the intensity of deals, and even the satisfaction of a well-made decision, all had been dulled. All he could think of was her, Sarah, now calling herself Marie, and that boy, Jake, whose fierce protection of his mother left no doubt that he was her son. Thomas spent the evening replaying every word, every expression, and every hollow gaze Sarah had given him in the park. He hadn't just lost her once, he'd somehow lost her twice. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Restlessness gnawed at him, and the image of Sarah's face, unfamiliar and distant, lingered in his mind. By morning, he knew he couldn't let this go. He needed answers. But where to start? He hadn't kept tabs on her since she'd vanished from his life. But now, armed with new motivation, he was determined to find out everything about what had happened in the years between them. By mid-morning, Thomas found himself back at the park, scanning the paths and benches. The air was warmer, the crowds thicker, and children's laughter echoed from a playground nearby. He walked slowly, deliberately, keeping an eye on every passerby, every figure that entered the park, hoping he'd see her again. At last, there she was. Sarah. No, Marie. Sitting alone on a bench near a fountain, reading a worn paperback novel. Her son, Jake, wasn't in sight, and Thomas seized the opportunity. His pulse quickened as he approached, but he moved quietly, not wanting to startle her. Marie, he said softly, testing the name, hoping she wouldn't turn him away this time. She looked up, her eyes faintly guarded but polite, as though trying to place him. Her gaze softened, but only with the vague recognition she might grant an acquaintance. "Hello. You're the man from yesterday, right?" she asked with a slight, polite smile. "I'm sorry if I seemed abrupt. You seemed so certain about knowing me." Thomas's heart skipped. He saw nothing in her eyes that hinted at their past, no flicker of memory or shared history, just the blank kindness of a stranger. He forced himself to smile, swallowing the urge to tell her everything. Yes, sorry," he replied, trying to keep his tone even. "I thought you looked like someone I once knew. I didn't mean to cause you any trouble." She looked at him with a hint of sympathy, studying him a moment before nodding. "It's all right. It's been a long time since anyone's thought they recognized me." Thomas hesitated, glancing around the park to make sure they weren't overheard. "Marie, can I ask? Do you remember anything about your life before here? Before New York?" At this, her expression grew distant, thoughtful. She looked away, her gaze falling on the fountain's gentle ripples. I don't know much about what you're asking," she said slowly. "I've been here for a few years, maybe a bit more, with Jake. Everything else, it's mostly a blur." Thomas felt a chill run through him. So it was true. She didn't remember anything. Not him, not their past, nothing. He pressed on gently, hoping she'd open up. "I'm sorry to pry. I don't understand how you could lose so much, forget so much. Are you happy here, Marie? Is this the life you wanted?" She laughed softly, the sound tinged with a sadness he recognized. "I suppose it is the life I know," she said. "I don't think much about what I wanted. It's more about what's needed now. Work, making sure Jake is taken care of, finding enough to get by. It's a simple life. Not one I'd have expected, maybe, but it's all I have." Thomas's hands tightened in his pockets, frustration welling up inside him. It was wrong. She didn't deserve this life, scraping by, struggling to survive. And she didn't deserve to be burdened by a past she couldn't even remember. He looked down, steadying his voice before he spoke again. "Marie, I'd like to help you. I mean you and Jake," he offered. "If there's anything you need, any way I could help, I'd like to do that." She seemed taken aback by his offer, a look of cautious curiosity crossing her face. "That's kind of you," she said slowly. "But why would you want to help us? We don't even know you." Thomas hesitated, feeling the weight of truth and secrecy tugging at him. He couldn't reveal who he was yet, not until he understood more about what had happened to her. "Maybe I just want to help because I can," he said simply. "You remind me of someone who was important to me, someone I lost. Maybe I'm just hoping it will help me feel a little less alone." She nodded, considering his words, and finally smiled, though it was tinged with reserve. That's kind of you, really. But I'm not sure I'm the kind of person who knows how to accept that kind of help anymore. Maybe I could start small, he said, his voice nearly a whisper. A meal, maybe, with you and Jake? She looked down, her expression unreadable as she traced her finger along the edge of the bench. All right, she said softly. One meal, but just to say thank you. That's all I can promise. Thomas felt a surge of relief, nodding as he pulled out his phone. Tomorrow, then? There's a small restaurant near here. Quiet place. You can bring Jake. She nodded, glancing around the park and seeming to struggle with her decision. Tomorrow, she agreed quietly, her voice low, her eyes distant again. Jake would like that. Thomas forced himself to say goodbye, his heart aching with a mix of hope and anxiety. He had his chance. Tomorrow, he would see her again. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to bring her back to the life they'd once dreamed of. The next evening, Thomas arrived early at the small, tucked-away restaurant on the edge of the park. It was a quiet place, lit by soft, amber lights, with the kind of intimate ambience where people spoke in low voices, not wanting to break the tranquility. He took a table by the window, watching for any sign of her and Jake. The minutes crawled by as he waited, the tension coiling in his stomach as he imagined what he would say, how he would bring up their past without scaring her away. Finally, he saw them approaching, a woman and a boy, walking side by side through the dim light. Marie wore a faded sweater, and Jake's jacket looked 2 sizes too big. But even in these humble clothes, she still had that quiet grace that he remembered. They walked in, her gaze sweeping the room until she found him, and she gave him a polite nod. Thomas stood up, greeting them with a restrained smile as they joined him. Hi, Thomas, she said softly, with a hint of a smile that held both politeness and hesitation. Hi, Marie, he replied, stumbling slightly over the name, which still felt foreign to him. And you must be Jake, he added, looking down at the boy, who regarded him with cautious eyes. Jake nodded, his expression wary. Mom said you're a friend, he muttered, his tone holding a tinge of skepticism as if already testing Thomas's intentions. Thomas met his gaze and tried to keep his voice steady, gentle. Yeah, a friend, he said, smiling. It's good to meet you, Jake. They sat, and Thomas noticed Marie's hands resting protectively on the table near Jake, as though she was ready to shield him from anything unfamiliar. She glanced around, taking in the soft light and warmth of the restaurant, a small look of wonder crossing her face before she caught herself and looked down, modestly folding her hands. They ordered modestly, with Marie glancing carefully at prices before settling on simple dishes. Thomas wished he could urge her to choose more, to indulge, but he held back, not wanting to break the fragile trust she'd placed in him by coming here. As they waited for the food, he glanced at Jake, hoping to break the tension. So, Jake, he began, trying to keep his tone light, what's your favorite subject in school? The boy shrugged, his guarded gaze never wavering. I don't really like school, he mumbled. Then, glancing sideways at his mother, he added, but I'm good at math. Marie looked over, smiling softly. He's very good at math, she said, pride softening her tone. Sometimes he's even too smart for his own good, you know? Jake looked down, a slight flush rising on his cheeks, and Thomas felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. A strange warmth, a pride for this boy he barely knew. He couldn't shake the idea that he was sitting at a table with the family he'd once imagined, that maybe he had a right to be here. But the reality of Sarah's distance, her blank memory, weighed heavily on him, reminding him of how precarious this moment was. When the food arrived, Thomas couldn't help but notice how Marie's hand lingered near Jake's plate, as if she were silently making sure he had enough, that he was taken care of. She barely touched her own food at first, waiting until Jake had started before she allowed herself to eat. They ate in silence for a while, an awkwardness between them as they picked at their meals. Thomas wanted to fill the quiet, to say something that would bring her closer, but each word that came to his mind felt like a step too far. Finally, he set his fork down and looked at her, feeling the weight of his questions pressing against the unspoken rules of their meal. "Marie," he began carefully, "I know I don't know much about your life now, and I don't mean to pry, but if there's anything you need, you can always come to me. I can help if you'd let me." She looked up from her plate, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. She hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of her glass as she searched for words. We manage fine," she replied finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's hard, of course, but that's life, isn't it?" Thomas wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't have to live like this, not when he could make things easier. But the look in her eyes, a mixture of pride and resignation, stopped him. He nodded slowly, swallowing his urge to say more. Jake, who had been following the exchange with watchful eyes, suddenly broke in. "Why do you want to help us so much?" he asked, his young voice blunt but curious. Thomas looked at him, startled by the question. Jake's gaze was intense, sharper than he'd expected from someone so young. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because," he began slowly, "sometimes when you care about someone, you just want to help, even if it's been a long time since you last saw them." He glanced at Marie, hoping she'd see past his words to the truth, but her expression remained guarded, her gaze fixed on her glass. "That's kind of you, really," she murmured, though her tone was polite, distant. "But we're not charity cases, Thomas. I'm sure you understand." The words stung, though he knew they were meant more as a boundary than an insult. He nodded, accepting her terms, feeling the frustration well up inside him. He wanted to break through her reserve, to shake her out of whatever fog had hidden her memory, but he knew he couldn't push her. Not yet. As the meal drew to an end, Thomas felt a desperation building in him, a sense that this might be his only chance. He wanted to say something real, something that would linger, something that might spark a memory. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a soft, earnest tone. "Marie, there was a time in my life when I would have done anything to be where I am now. But back then, all of it meant nothing compared to what I had with someone. She was everything to me." His eyes softened as he spoke, his gaze steady on hers. "I don't know why, but you remind me of her. So, forgive me if I seem too forward. It's just that I lost her once, and I don't want to feel that loss again." Marie's face softened, her eyes flickering with something. Sympathy, perhaps, or the barest hint of recognition. But just as quickly, the expression faded, her gaze becoming unreadable once more. She looked down, her fingers wrapping around her glass, as if grounding herself. "People come and go," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes, it's just meant to be that way." Thomas's heart clenched. It was the kind of thing she would have said, the kind of stoic acceptance she'd always had. But as much as he wanted to believe she was still in there, hidden beneath this new identity, he knew she was still far away, lost to memories that hadn't surfaced. Jake shifted beside her, clearly sensing the tension but unsure what to make of it. Finally, he nudged his mother, pulling her from the conversation. "Mom, can we go now?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "It's getting late." Marie glanced at Thomas, giving him a nod. "Thank you for the meal, Thomas," she said, her voice polite but final. "It was kind of you. But we should be going." He wanted to reach out, to beg her to stay, to tell her everything. But he knew it wouldn't help. She wasn't ready. So he stood up, offering a gentle smile to Jake and a lingering look at her. "Anytime, Marie," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be here, if you ever need me." As he watched them leave, a sense of loss settled over him, a heavy, aching weight. But in that moment, he made a promise to himself. He wouldn't give up, not on her, not on their memories. He would find a way to break through, to reach her, no matter how long it took. Because she was still Sarah, somewhere deep down, and he was determined to bring her back to herself. Thomas couldn't let go. Days passed, and he found himself revisiting the memories he'd once tried so hard to bury. Summer afternoons with Sarah, long talks that stretched into the night, promises they'd made to each other about the future. And yet, he couldn't reconcile that Sarah with the cautious, polite woman who called herself Marie, who stared back at him like a stranger. Determined to understand what had happened to her, Thomas began a careful, almost obsessive inquiry into Sarah's past, into everything she'd left behind when she'd vanished. He reached out to old contacts, sifted through records, and hired a private investigator to trace what little information he had on her disappearance. Slowly, he started to uncover fragments of a story. It turned out that, just months after he'd last seen her, Sarah had been involved in a terrible accident. The details were scarce, but the investigator confirmed a report of a woman matching Sarah's description who had been found unconscious, with no identification, in a remote area outside the city. She'd suffered a severe head injury, the kind that left gaps in memory, fragments of a life scattered like puzzle pieces with missing parts. The records indicated she'd been taken in by a local shelter, and after her release from the hospital, she had seemingly started over, carving out a new life for herself and, eventually, for Jake. Thomas's heart ached as he pieced it together. She hadn't left him by choice. She'd lost herself entirely, stripped of her past, her memories, her identity. All this time, she'd been living as someone else, forced to rebuild a life without even the foundation of her own history. The discovery left him breathless, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Knowing what had happened, he felt a fierce determination rise in him. He would do whatever it took to help her remember, to bring her back. Days later, Thomas saw her again. She was sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, this time with Jake beside her. The boy was quiet, absorbed in his own world, drawing something in a battered notebook. Thomas approached carefully, aware that his presence was a fragile thread that could snap if he pulled too hard. He knew he couldn't tell her everything yet. She wasn't ready. But he could try to rekindle something, a memory, a feeling, a familiar connection. "Marie," he called, keeping his voice soft, gentle. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to that careful politeness she always wore. But Thomas noticed a flicker of something else in her gaze, a curiosity, a faint hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thomas," she greeted, nodding slightly. Jake glanced up, eyeing Thomas warily, but his mother gave him a small smile, as if silently reassuring him. "I was just passing by," Thomas said, though it was a lie. They both knew it. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" She hesitated, but then nodded, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. He sat down, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The quiet sounds of the park filled the silence, the faint laughter of children, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of city life just beyond the trees. Finally, Thomas broke the silence, glancing over at Jake's notebook. "What are you drawing there, Jake?" he asked. The boy looked at him, a mix of suspicion and pride in his eyes. "It's a spaceship," he replied, holding up the sketch. Thomas was surprised by the detail. The lines were crisp, precise, and the design intricate for a boy his age. "Wow," Thomas said, genuinely impressed. "That's amazing. You're really talented." Jake shrugged, trying to play it cool, but there was a glimmer of pride in his expression. Thomas felt a pang of sadness, realizing he'd missed so much of this boy's life, never knowing the moments and talents that made him who he was. He turned back to Marie, searching for a way to draw her into conversation. I've been thinking about what you said last time, about how life doesn't always turn out how we planned." She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "Yes, I guess we all learned that at some point." There was something vulnerable in her expression, a sadness she tried to hide but couldn't completely mask. Thomas sensed an opening, a chance to reach deeper, to connect with the person he knew was still somewhere inside her. "Marie," he began, choosing his words carefully, "what if there were things about your past that you could remember? Would you want to?" Her eyes darted up, alarmed, and for a moment, Thomas worried he'd gone too far. But then she sighed, looking away, her gaze drifting to the park as if searching for an answer among the trees. "I don't know," she said softly. "Sometimes, I feel like there's something missing, like pieces of my life that just aren't there. But I don't know if I'd want them back." She paused, her hands clenching slightly. "Sometimes, Not knowing feels safer. Thomas's heart twisted. He understood her fear, her reluctance to face a past that might only bring pain. But he couldn't give up. I can understand that, he said gently. But maybe there's something good in those memories too. Something worth remembering. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to see something beyond his words. There was a moment of stillness, a silence filled with unspoken words, unacknowledged history. But before she could answer, Jake interrupted, tugging at her sleeve. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm hungry. Can we go get something to eat?" Marie blinked, the spell broken. She looked down at her son, giving him a quick smile, then turned back to Thomas. "I should go," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "Thank you for talking with us." Thomas nodded, hiding the disappointment that threatened to surface. "Of course, anytime." As she stood and took Jake's hand, Thomas felt a surge of desperation. He couldn't let her walk away again, not without trying one last time. "Marie," he called, and she turned, looking back at him expectantly. "Take this," he said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. It was an old one, with pages that had yellowed slightly over time. But inside were handwritten notes, sketches, bits and pieces from the years they'd spent together. He held it out to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe it will mean something to you. No pressure to look at it, but if you ever feel ready, it's yours." She looked at the notebook with a mix of curiosity and hesitation, then slowly reached out and took it, slipping it into her bag with a faint nod. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost too soft to hear. She gave him one last look before she turned, and Thomas watched as she and Jake walked away, the notebook hidden in her bag, carrying memories she didn't yet know she held. As they disappeared into the crowd, Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step, a chance. And for now, he would have to believe it was enough. The next few days were a blur for Thomas. Every hour he found himself wondering if she had opened the notebook, if she was sitting somewhere, turning its pages, letting each memory sink in and awaken something inside her. He'd filled that notebook with fragments of their past, drawings from lazy Sunday afternoons, small messages, even notes she'd left him in their shared apartment back then. Each piece of paper held a moment, a story, a reminder of the life they'd once shared. He could only hope she would read it and feel a spark of recognition, some hint of the love they had known. It was a rainy afternoon when he saw her again. He'd gone to the park on a whim, not expecting to find her, but there she was, sitting on the same bench where they'd talked last. She looked different, more fragile somehow, her gaze distant as she watched the raindrops hit the ground around her, her hands wrapped tightly around a familiar, small notebook. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, and approached her cautiously. "Marie," he said, stopping a few feet away. She looked up, her expression clouded, as if she were seeing him through a haze of memories. She held up the notebook, her fingers tracing its worn cover. I read this," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "Every page. And I don't know what to think." Thomas sat down beside her, close enough to feel her presence, though he kept his distance, respecting the boundaries she still seemed to need. "I hoped it might help you remember," he said softly, "to remind you of who you were, who we were." She looked at him, her eyes filled with questions, emotions swirling behind them that she couldn't seem to put into words. "It feels familiar," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The words, the drawings, there's something there, like a dream I can't quite reach. But," she trailed off, struggling with her next words. "But it feels like someone else's life," she finished, looking down at her hands. "Like I'm reading about another woman, someone who loved deeply, who was happy. And yet, I can't feel any of it. It's like I'm locked out of my own memories." Thomas's heart ached as he listened. He could see the pain in her eyes, the confusion, the yearning to understand herself. And he knew then how much she was struggling to reconcile this stranger she read about with the woman she had become. But he couldn't give up. He needed her to keep going, to keep reaching into the past, even if it was painful. "Maybe it just takes time," he offered gently. "Sometimes memories come back slowly, in pieces. It's like rebuilding something fragile, one piece at a time, she sighed, closing her eyes briefly, as though trying to steady herself. I don't know if I want them back, she whispered. What if those memories come with things I don't want to remember? Pain, loss, things I've already left behind? Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her fear. I can't promise it won't be hard, Marie. I know there's pain in there, too. But there's also joy, love, a life that meant something. He paused, his voice softening. And I think you owe it to yourself to know that part of you, even if it's hard. She didn't answer, her gaze drifting back to the notebook. For a long moment, she sat in silence, her fingers tracing the worn pages as if trying to feel what was locked within them. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. There are moments, lately, little flashes of something, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes when I'm walking through the park, or when Jake says something a certain way, it's like I know him. I know Jake, of course, she added quickly, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. But there's this feeling, like there was someone else who loved him too. Someone else inside me who... She stopped, her voice breaking, and Thomas felt his own emotions swell, a mix of hope and pain that he could barely contain. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to reassure her, but he knew he had to let her find her way on her own. You're not alone, Marie, he said softly. I'm here for you. Jake's here. We're not asking you to change or to become someone else. Just to be open to the possibility of who you might have been. She nodded, though her face remained a mask of uncertainty. Then, almost as if the words were being pulled from her, she looked at him and asked, Tell me about her. About me. Thomas's breath caught. He dreamed of this moment, of being able to share who she was, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of it, the gravity of revealing a life she couldn't remember. He took a deep breath and looked into her eyes, seeing both a stranger and the woman he'd once loved. Her name was Sarah, he began, his voice soft, reverent. She was the woman who believed in people, who loved deeply. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when she looked at you. She had dreams, big dreams. She wanted to travel, to see the world, to make a difference. Marie listened, her eyes never leaving his face, absorbing each word like it was part of a puzzle she was trying to solve. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he felt her presence, as he saw her listening. She was stubborn too, he added with a faint smile. If she believed in something, nothing could sway her. Not even me. She had this incredible strength, this resilience. And she loved fiercely. She loved you, Jake. She would have loved you more than anything. At the mention of Jake, her eyes softened, and she looked down, almost as if ashamed. He deserves a better mother than the one I am now, she murmured, her voice choked. Thomas reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently placing his hand over hers. Marie, you're a good mother, he said, his voice steady. You're here for him. You protect him. You care for him. The woman I knew, Sarah, would be proud of you. She looked down at their hands, her expression a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Thomas was content to sit with her, sharing the quiet, allowing her to process the words and memories he'd given her. But then, without warning, she pulled her hand away, her gaze darkening as if realizing the weight of everything he'd just told her. Thomas, she whispered, her voice filled with a sudden, intense vulnerability. What if I don't want to be that person anymore? What if Marie is all I can be? Thomas felt a pang of sadness but nodded, understanding. He had asked her to remember, but he hadn't considered the possibility that she might not want to go back, that she might have chosen this life over the one she'd lost. If that's what you want, he said quietly, I'll respect it. I'll respect whatever you decide. She looked away, nodding, though he could see the conflict in her eyes. She clutched the notebook to her chest, as though it were both a comfort and a burden, the weight of her forgotten past pressing against her present self. They sat together in silence, a silence filled with questions neither of them could answer. And as the rain continued to fall around them, Thomas realized that whatever happened next would be up to her. Whether she chose to remember or let go, he would stand by her. She was still Sarah to him. Marie or not, remembered or not, she was still the woman he'd loved. And that, he knew, would never change. Days passed, and Thomas tried to focus on work, tried to immerse himself in the endless demands of his business, but he found himself distracted, his thoughts always returning to Marie, Sarah, and the fragile path she was navigating. He could see her face clearly in his mind. The guarded expression, the vulnerability when she spoke about Jake, the conflict he'd seen in her eyes when she held the notebook close to her chest. Then, late one afternoon, he received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, and his heart raced as he answered, half hoping, half fearing what he might hear on the other end. "Hello?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thomas," came Marie's soft voice, tentative and careful, as though she'd been weighing every word before calling. "It's me, Marie." He swallowed, barely able to contain the surge of emotion her voice brought. "Marie," he replied, forcing himself to stay calm. "It's good to hear from you." There was a long pause on the line, as if she were trying to decide what to say next. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying a hint of the uncertainty he'd come to recognize in her. Would you meet me? I'd like to talk." "Of course," he said instantly, his heart racing. "Anywhere, anytime." They agreed on a small coffee shop a few blocks from the park. Thomas arrived early, settling into a seat near the window where he could see her approach. As he waited, he watched people pass by, feeling a strange mix of hope and anxiety. When she finally arrived, she looked different, more introspective, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. She spotted him and offered a faint smile, walking over with the notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she sat down, placing the notebook on the table between them. She kept her hands on it, as though it were an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. "Of course," he replied, unable to keep the relief from his voice. "I'm just glad you called." She nodded, staring down at the notebook before glancing up at him, her expression serious. "I read it all again," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And I want to remember. I think I'm ready to know who I was, who we were." Thomas felt a rush of hope, his heart swelling with anticipation. He tried to contain the overwhelming desire to reach across the table, to reassure her, to thank her for opening herself to the past. "I'll be here with you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Every step of the way. You're not alone in this." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken connection that hadn't been there before. Slowly, she opened the notebook, flipping to a page where he'd sketched a small picture of the beach they'd once visited together, the waves gently lapping against the shore. She traced the drawing with her fingertip, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I had a dream," she said quietly, as though speaking more to herself than to him. "I was standing on a beach, but it wasn't just a dream. It felt real, like I'd been there before." She glanced up, searching his face as if hoping he'd fill in the missing pieces. "We used to go there," he replied softly. "You loved the beach. We'd spend hours just listening to the waves, talking about the future." He smiled at the memory, watching as a faint light of recognition flickered in her eyes. She nodded, as if his words were helping to solidify the dream, to turn it into something tangible. "It felt so familiar," she murmured. "I was happy, like everything I needed was there." Right in that moment, Thomas felt his own emotions rise, his voice thick as he continued. "That was the way we felt, like nothing else mattered. Just us, together. You once told me it was your favorite place in the world." She looked down, her expression torn between wonder and sorrow. "How could I forget something like that? How could I lose everything?" Her voice broke, and she placed a hand over her mouth, trying to contain the wave of emotions. Thomas reached across the table, gently resting his hand on hers. "It wasn't your fault," he said softly. "None of this was your fault. You lost your memories, but not because you wanted to. You survived something unimaginable, Marie. And now, you're finding your way back, piece by piece." She took a shaky breath, squeezing his hand as she steadied herself. I don't want Jake to know, not yet. He's been through so much already. I don't want him to worry or feel like he's losing the mother he knows. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her choice. You don't have to tell him until you're ready. This journey, it's yours to take however you need to. She nodded, her expression softening, and for the first time, he saw a hint of peace in her eyes. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table, both of them taking in the significance of this fragile moment. Will you help me remember? She asked finally, her voice filled with quiet determination. Of course, he replied without hesitation. I'll tell you everything, all of it, whenever you're ready. They began to meet regularly, in that coffee shop, in the park, even near the beach he'd described to her. Each time, Thomas would share a story, a memory, a piece of their past. He told her about the time they'd stayed up all night, talking about their dreams, their plans. He reminded her of the small arguments they'd had, the silly things that now seemed insignificant, but were, to them, part of the fabric of their love. Slowly, he saw changes in her. Her laughter became more familiar, her smile holding a hint of the woman he'd once known. She grew more at ease, sometimes finishing his sentences or recalling small details, as though her mind were bridging the gap between who she was and who she had become. One day, after they'd spent the morning talking, she looked at him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Thomas, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I remember the way you used to look at me, like I was the only person in the world. He felt his breath catch, his heart pounding. You were, he replied softly, and you still are. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the years between them dissolving, leaving only the here and now. He could see it in her eyes, the beginning of recognition, the pieces of her life settling back into place. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude, for not giving up, for finding me, even when I didn't know how to find myself. He smiled, feeling a depth of love and relief that he hadn't felt in years. I would have looked forever, he replied, his voice thick with emotion, because you're worth it. Every memory, every moment, it's all worth it. And in that instant, he knew that no matter how long it took, no matter how much they'd lost, he had finally found her again. Together, they would continue to uncover her past, to rebuild the life that had been taken from them, piece by piece, memory by memory, because he had faith that love, even when forgotten, could never truly be lost. The journey to reclaiming her memories was delicate, as though Thomas and Marie were uncovering a treasure hidden under years of dust and shadows. With each meeting, each conversation, Marie seemed to gather pieces of her past, little fragments of who she had been. Yet, despite her growing familiarity with the life they had once shared, Thomas sensed an unease in her, something unresolved. One afternoon, they met by the park again, this time at a quiet bench shaded by a cluster of trees. Marie seemed tense, her hands clasped together tightly, her gaze distant. Thomas waited, letting the silence settle around them, understanding by now that sometimes she needed space before she could let the words come. Thomas, she said finally, her voice uncertain, I need to ask you something I've been afraid to bring up. He looked at her, his expression gentle. You can ask me anything, Marie, she sighed, biting her lip as she gathered her thoughts. The more I remember, the more I wonder about what happened to me, about why I ended up losing my memory, losing us. She glanced down, her brow furrowing in confusion. Do you know anything about it? About what could have happened to me back then? Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually, but unprepared for the pain it would bring. He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze with the honesty she deserved. After you disappeared, he began slowly. I looked everywhere. I tried to find you, to understand why you'd left. For the longest time, I thought you'd chosen to leave without a word. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. But later, I found out you'd been in an accident, a bad one. That's how you lost your memory. She absorbed his words, her expression shifting from sadness to shock. An accident? She whispered. What kind of accident? Thomas shook his head, frustration welling up inside him. I don't know much about it, only that it happened outside the city. You were found alone, unconscious. There were no witnesses, no answers. By the time I tracked you down, you'd already become someone else. She looked away, her hand trembling as she ran her fingers through her hair. So, that's why I have these flashes. These shadows of a life I didn't know I'd lost. Thomas reached over, placing his hand gently over hers. Yes, he said softly. That's why. But I don't know everything. I don't know what caused the accident, or why you were so far away from home. He paused, searching her face. Marie, is there something specific you're afraid to remember? She glanced up, her eyes filled with turmoil. It's not that I'm afraid, exactly, she murmured. It's more that every memory I recover feels like it comes with questions, with doubts. Her voice grew quiet, filled with vulnerability. What if there was something dark in my past? Something that could hurt Jake, or you? Thomas's heart ached at the thought. He wanted to reach out, to reassure her, to tell her that nothing could make him doubt her, but he knew she needed to work through this fear herself. He tightened his grip on her hand, his voice firm. Marie, Sarah, whatever happened, it wasn't your fault, he said gently. And you have Jake now. You have me. Whatever you're worried about, we'll face it together. She looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes, though the unease remained. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the quiet of the park embrace them. But then she took a deep breath, her gaze steady as though she'd resolved something within herself. Maybe it's time I try to remember everything, she said slowly. Even if it hurts, even if it scares me. I can't keep living with half a life, half a story. Thomas nodded, admiration and love welling up inside him. We'll take it one step at a time, he promised. And if there's anything I can do to help, I will. The days that followed were intense, as Marie began to dig deeper into her past, questioning everything she thought she knew. She began seeing a therapist to guide her through the memories that surfaced, working carefully to confront the fragments of her old life. She spent hours alone, revisiting the notebook Thomas had given her, trying to unlock memories that felt just out of reach. Then, one evening, she called him, her voice trembling with urgency. Thomas, can you meet me? There's something I need to show you. They met at a small diner, tucked away from the main street. She was already seated when he arrived, her expression serious, the notebook open in front of her. She barely looked up as he took a seat, her fingers tracing a page filled with his handwriting. Look at this, she said, her voice low, her finger hovering over a specific line he had written years ago. Asterisk, I don't care how far you go, or how lost you feel. I'll always find you, asterisk. Thomas remembered writing it, late one night after an argument they'd had, a silly fight over something he could no longer recall. He had scribbled it down as a reminder to her, a promise he never thought he'd actually have to keep. I wrote that for you, he said softly. Back when things were simple. She nodded, her eyes focused on the words, as if trying to draw strength from them. I had a dream last night, she whispered, her gaze distant. I was in a car, and there was rain. I couldn't see the road. And then I remember feeling weightless, like I was falling. She looked up at him, fear flickering in her eyes. I think the accident wasn't an accident. Thomas's heart raced, a chill running down his spine. What do you mean? She shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know. It's just a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right, that someone else was there, someone who wanted to hurt me. Thomas felt a surge of anger, protectiveness surging within him. He reached across the table, taking her hands firmly. If someone tried to hurt you, Marie, we'll find out who. I won't let anyone harm you or Jake. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. I know, but if I'm right, if this wasn't an accident, then everything changes. My past isn't just my own. It's something that could affect us now, our lives, our future. Thomas nodded, his grip on her hands unwavering. Then we'll find the truth together, no matter where it leads. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady, as though she'd finally accepted that facing the darkness of her past was the only way forward. "I want to know everything, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with a fierce resolve. "Not just the memories we shared, but the truth of what happened. I need to remember everything, even if it hurts." He squeezed her hands, his voice filled with conviction. "Then we'll uncover it all. We'll bring every shadow into the light." As they sat there, the reality of what they were about to face settled over them like a storm waiting to break. They knew that their search for answers might take them to places neither of them wanted to go, uncover secrets that had long been buried. But they also knew they couldn't turn back, couldn't return to the half-truths and forgotten memories. Together, they would face whatever came next, holding on to each other as they navigated the darkness, knowing that only by confronting the past could they ever hope to build a future. Thomas and Marie decided to leave no stone unturned in their search for the truth. They started by looking at police records and accident reports, anything that might shed light on the day she disappeared. Thomas made calls to hospitals and shelters, tracking down anyone who might remember her arrival, the day she'd stumbled into the world as a stranger to herself. With each step, the mystery deepened, and it became clear that they were venturing into the unknown. One evening, they sat in Thomas's living room, documents and notes spread across the coffee table. The air was tense, filled with the weight of unanswered questions. Marie, her face drawn with exhaustion, picked up a newspaper clipping from the pile. It was an article about a car accident on a remote road outside the city, dated to the day she'd been found. "Look here," she said, pointing to a small detail in the article. "The police report mentions a black sedan that was seen leaving the area, but no one ever came forward. It says here the driver may have witnessed the accident, or worse, could have caused it." Thomas leaned in, studying the report carefully, his jaw tightening. "Do you remember anything about a black car? Anything at all that might give us a clue?" She closed her eyes, concentrating, her brow furrowing as she dug into the hazy fragments of that day. It's strange," she murmured. "In my dreams, I sometimes see headlights in the rain. It's as if they're coming toward me, but then everything fades." Thomas took her hand, grounding her. "We'll keep looking. Whoever was in that car, they may be the key to all of this." They sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustling of papers as they sorted through the remaining documents. Thomas's phone buzzed suddenly, jolting them from their quiet focus. He picked it up, frowning when he saw it was the investigator he'd hired. "Hello? Thomas," came the man's gruff voice, filled with urgency. "I found something. There's a name that keeps coming up in connection with her accident, a man named Edward Bishop. He's been tied to several unsolved cases involving women who vanished only to reappear with no memory. And he has a reputation. Let's just say it's not a good one." Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean? Are you saying Marie's accident might not have been random?" "It's possible. Bishop owns a few properties near where the accident happened, places no one pays attention to. It's a dead zone, perfect for someone looking to stay hidden." Thomas thanked the investigator and ended the call, his heart pounding. He looked at Marie, who had been listening intently, her face pale. "Marie, do you know the name Edward Bishop?" he asked carefully. She shook her head, but a faint tremor passed through her, as though some part of her recognized it even if she couldn't remember. "No, but it feels familiar. Like I've heard it before, but I can't place it." Thomas watched her closely, worry etched on his face. "This man might be the reason you lost your memory. He's been linked to other cases like yours. Women who disappeared under mysterious circumstances." Marie shivered, pulling her arms around herself as if to ward off a chill. "But why? Why would someone do that to me? To anyone?" Thomas's eyes darkened, and he spoke slowly, his voice tinged with anger. "Sometimes, people like him. They get away with things because they know how to stay hidden. They prey on the vulnerable, knowing they won't be found out. But we'll make sure he doesn't stay hidden any longer." As they dug further into Edward Bishop's background, a sinister pattern began to emerge. He had ties to certain influential figures, people who were more than willing to turn a blind eye to his activities. Over the years, several young women had vanished, only to return with fractured memories and no idea of where they had been. Some had been labeled runaways, others merely victims of bad luck. But the connection was there, a dark thread linking them all to Bishop. Driven by a fierce need for answers, Thomas and Marie decided to visit one of the properties Bishop owned, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city where he'd allegedly kept some of his guests. They didn't know what they would find, but they felt they were getting closer to the truth. The night they drove out there, the sky was overcast, rain pattering against the windshield as they pulled up in front of the building. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its broken windows staring back at them like empty eyes. Thomas cut the engine, glancing over at Marie. "Are you sure you want to do this?" She took a shaky breath, steeling herself. "I have to. I need to know what happened to me, no matter how painful it might be." They stepped out of the car, moving cautiously toward the entrance. Thomas pushed open the rusted door, the creak echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew permeating the darkness. They switched on flashlights, the beams cutting through the gloom as they navigated the abandoned rooms. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Marie began to feel a strange sense of familiarity. She stopped suddenly, her flashlight illuminating a cracked mirror on the wall. For a moment, she was overcome by a wave of disorientation, as if she were reliving a moment from a forgotten life. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice shaking. I think I've been here before." He moved closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Take your time. Let yourself remember." She closed her eyes, letting the memories come. She saw flashes, herself alone, afraid, her clothes torn, a dark figure watching her from the shadows. There had been a voice, cold and detached, saying something she couldn't quite grasp. The memory was broken, jagged, like a photograph that had been torn to pieces. "I was here," she said, her voice barely audible. "I remember. Someone was watching me." He kept saying, "You're not going anywhere." And I felt so trapped, so helpless. Thomas's grip on her shoulder tightened, his jaw clenching with anger. "Marie, that's over. You're safe now. Whatever he did, whatever he took from you, we're going to make him pay." They pressed on, moving down a narrow hallway that led to a small room at the back. The door was slightly ajar, and Thomas nudged it open, revealing a dimly lit space with an old chair in the center, its arms bound with fraying ropes. The sight sent a shiver down Marie's spine, a visceral sense of dread filling her as she took it in. This is where he kept me," she whispered, her voice filled with horror. Thomas felt his blood run cold as he looked around, realizing the reality of her nightmare. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, trying to shield her from the terrible truth of the place. But Marie didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped forward, her face determined. "No," she said firmly. "I need to see this. I need to face it. If this is where I lost myself, then I need to remember." Thomas watched her, his heart aching with pride and sorrow. He knew how hard this was for her, but he also understood her need to confront her past, to reclaim the memories she'd lost. As she stood in the center of the room, a memory surfaced, one that made her gasp. He told me I didn't have a choice," she murmured, her eyes wide with fear and clarity. "He said no one would come looking for me, that I would be forgotten." Thomas's face hardened, his voice filled with conviction. "But you weren't forgotten. I found you. And now, we'll make sure he never does this to anyone else." They stood there together, in the dark room that had once been her prison, and Marie felt a shift within herself, a small but powerful reclaiming of her strength. She had faced the darkness, the place where her life had been taken from her, and now, standing with Thomas beside her, she felt the weight of her past lifting, replaced by a fierce determination to move forward. With one last look around, she took Thomas's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. "I've seen enough. It's time we end this." And as they walked out of the warehouse, stepping back into the light of the rainy night, Marie felt a sense of release, a liberation from the shadows that had haunted her. Together, she and Thomas had found the truth, and now they were ready to begin the fight to bring Edward Bishop to justice, to ensure that he would never harm another soul again. With the truth now fully illuminated, Marie and Thomas were determined to bring Edward Bishop to justice. Their resolve had only strengthened since their visit to the warehouse, where Marie had confronted the darkest corners of her lost past. She was no longer the woman who had hesitated to reclaim her memories. She had become someone new, someone who could face the shadows with an unwavering resolve. Thomas reached out to a trusted contact in law enforcement, a seasoned investigator named Detective Sanders, who had seen enough cases like Marie's to understand the complexity and weight of her experience. Together, they went over the evidence. The connection between Bishop and the warehouse, the records of other women who had suffered similarly, the faint threads tying him to Marie's accident. But the case would be difficult to prosecute. Bishop had friends in high places, people who wouldn't hesitate to protect him. A few weeks later, Thomas and Marie found themselves sitting in a sterile room at the police station, with Detective Sanders laying out the steps they'd need to take to make sure Bishop couldn't evade justice. "Look," Sanders said, his tone serious, his hands folded over the file. "To make this stick, we'll need your full cooperation. You'll likely need to testify, Marie. Your testimony is crucial if we're going to take this man down." Marie nodded, the gravity of his words sinking in. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady. "I won't let him do this to anyone else. I'll testify whatever it takes." Thomas squeezed her hand, silently assuring her that he'd be by her side through it all. She looked back at him, grateful, feeling a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The next few months were grueling. Marie spent countless hours with Detective Sanders and the prosecutor, recounting every detail she could remember, reliving painful memories she'd hoped to leave behind. But each time she felt herself falter, she would remember that she was doing this for Jake, for herself, and for all the others who had suffered because of Edward Bishop. She was determined to close this chapter with courage, knowing she was no longer that lost, fragile woman from years before. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with spectators and reporters, all eager to hear the sensational case unfold. Edward Bishop sat at the defendant's table, his expression cool, unflinching, as though he still believed he could escape this. But Marie felt none of the fear she'd once had. Instead, she felt only a powerful, unshakable determination. When she took the stand, she could feel every eye in the room on her, but she focused on Thomas, seated in the gallery, his gaze steady and encouraging. She recounted the memories, each one as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The dark figure in the shadows, the threats, the fear she had lived with for so long. Her voice shook at times, but she kept going, each word a strike against the man who had tried to take her life from her. At one point, the defense attorney attempted to discredit her, insinuating that her memories were unreliable, that she was merely misremembering events that had taken place so long ago. But Marie held her ground, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "I know what happened to me," she said firmly, looking directly at Bishop. "You can try to erase someone's memory, to take away everything they know and love, but you can't erase who they are. You can't erase the truth." When she finished her testimony, the room was silent. No one moved as she stepped down, her gaze never leaving Bishop's, who for the first time seemed to falter, his composure cracking under her stare. The trial continued for several more days, with witness after witness testifying to Bishop's long history of manipulation, control, and fear. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that this time, he wouldn't walk away. The jury deliberated for hours, but in the end, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all charges. The room erupted in relief, and Thomas reached for Marie, pulling her into an embrace, both of them overwhelmed by the victory, the end to years of uncertainty and fear. When they stepped outside the courthouse, Marie felt an immense weight lift from her shoulders. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and she breathed deeply, letting herself take in the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with pride and admiration. "You did it, Marie. You faced him and you won." She looked back at him, a soft smile breaking through. "No, we did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I always told you I'd find you. I'm just glad you let me bring you back." They stood there for a long moment, taking in the world around them, the sense of peace that had been absent from their lives for so long. And in that silence, Marie realized that, for the first time in years, she felt whole. She'd faced the darkness, had reclaimed her past, and now, she was ready to embrace the future. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Marie and Thomas grew closer, their bond deepening as they rebuilt the life they'd once dreamed of together. Jake, who had only known fragments of his mother's past, now understood her strength and resilience, and his admiration for her grew. Together, they formed a new family, bound by the trials they'd endured, the love they'd rediscovered, and the future they would build together. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Marie and Thomas took a walk along the beach they had once visited all those years ago. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the air filled with the scent of salt and freedom. Marie looked out at the horizon, her hand in Thomas's, a sense of calm settling over her. "Do you ever think about the life we might have had if things had been different?" she asked softly, a wistful note in her voice. Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand. "Sometimes. But then I think about where we are now, and I realize that we're exactly where we're meant to be." She looked at him, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas, for finding me, for never giving up." He turned to her, his expression filled with the same love and loyalty he had held for her all those years. "I told you once that I'd always find you, no matter how far. And I meant it." They stood there, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. And in that moment, they knew that their journey, with all its twists and turns, had finally led them back to where they belonged, together, ready to start anew. With a quiet sense of peace, they walked along the shore, hand in hand, their past behind them, their future wide open, and their hearts forever intertwined.